Rodney Alcala, known as the dating game killer, was one of the most chilling predators of the 1970s. A seemingly charming man who once appeared on national television, Alcala used his photography skills to lure his victims, often young women and girls, into deadly traps. Over the years, he evaded justice, leaving a trail of heartbreak and unanswered questions. In this video, we'll explore how he blended into society, the shocking crimes he committed, and how the authorities finally put an end to his reign of terror. Before we dive into the case, if you're interested in more true crime stories like this one, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We've got plenty of in-depth content coming your way, and you won't want to miss it. Let's get started. Rodney Alcala was born on August 23, 1943 in San Antonio, Texas, to a Mexican-American family. His birth name was Rodrigo Jacques Alcala Bucor. When he was still a child, his father abandoned the family, leaving his mother to raise him and his siblings on her own. After his father left, the family relocated to Los Angeles, California, where Rodney spent most of his formative years. As a young boy, Alcala showed signs of being highly intelligent. He was reportedly a good student with a high IQ, and by many accounts he was considered charming and personable. However, beneath this exterior, there were early warning signs of deviant behavior. According to those who knew him, Alcala was often described as socially awkward and withdrawn, and some suggested he exhibited unusual behavior as early as his teenage years. Despite these signs, nothing at the time suggested the horrors that would later unfold in his life. In 1961, at the age of 17, Alcala joined the U.S. Army and trained as a clerk. However, his time in the military was cut short when, in 1964, he suffered a nervous breakdown. He went AWOL, hitchhiking across the country before eventually turning himself in to military police. After being diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, Alcala was discharged from the Army on medical grounds. This diagnosis would later come into play as a critical factor in understanding his behavior, but at the time, he was released without much attention or concern. After leaving the military, Alcala enrolled at UCLA, where he studied fine arts. It was during this period in his life that his deviant behavior began to escalate. Despite outwardly appearing as a normal young man pursuing higher education, Alcala was already showing signs of the predatory nature that would later define him. In 1968, Alcala committed his first known serious crime. An 8-year-old girl named Tali Shapiro was walking to school in Hollywood when Alcala lured her into his car. A passing motorist witnessed the incident and contacted the police, who arrived at Alcala's apartment just in time to save the young girl's life. Inside the apartment, they found Shapiro severely beaten and sexually assaulted, but Alcala managed to escape, fleeing to the East Coast and evading capture for several years. After fleeing California, Alcala assumed the alias John Berger and enrolled at New York University, where he studied film under Roman Polanski. During this time, he continued his predatory behavior, but for a while he managed to avoid detection. His charm and intelligence allowed him to blend into society and escape the consequences of his crimes, all while continuing to lead a double life as a predator. In 1971, Alcala was added to the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. He was eventually recognized by 2 children at an arts camp in New Hampshire, where he had been working as a counselor under his assumed identity. This led to his arrest, and he was extradited back to California to face charges for the assault and attempted murder of Tali Shapiro. However, due to a lack of cooperation from Shapiro's family, who had moved to Mexico and did not want their daughter to relive the traumatic event, Alcala was allowed to plead guilty to a lesser charge of child molestation. He served just 34 months before being released on parole. This lenient sentence marked the beginning of a pattern in Alcala's criminal career, where legal technicalities and gaps in the system allowed him to continue committing heinous crimes for years. Despite his brief stint in prison, his deviant behavior had only just begun. Rodney Alcala's ability to present himself as a charming and respectable individual played a significant role in his crimes. One of the most effective tools he used to lure his victims was his guise as a professional photographer. Alcala often posed as an aspiring photographer, approaching young women and girls in public places, including beaches and parks, and offering them free photo sessions. He would carry a camera and claim he was building a portfolio or working on an artistic project. His good looks and seemingly harmless demeanor made him appear trustworthy to many of his potential victims. This false image of a professional photographer allowed Alcala to gain the trust of vulnerable women who were often flattered by the attention. They believed they were participating in a legitimate opportunity, unaware of his dark intentions. Alcala's photography hobby was not merely a cover, it was an integral part of his crimes. He would take pictures of his victims, sometimes before, during, or after their assault. These photos became chilling evidence of his predatory behavior. In 1979, after Alcala was arrested, authorities discovered hundreds of photos in his possession, many of which featured unidentified women and young girls. Some of these photographs were taken in what appeared to be professional staged settings, while others showed more casual and intimate portraits. The identities of many of the women in these photos remain unknown to this day, raising the horrifying possibility that some of them may have been additional, undiscovered victims. Law enforcement released the images to the public in an effort to identify the women, and while some were recognized, many were not. This trove of photographs became one of the most disturbing aspects of Alcala's criminal history, as it suggested that the full extent of his crimes might never be known. Alcala's modus operandi was brutal and methodical. He primarily targeted young women, although there were instances where he preyed on teenage girls and even children. His approach to his victims was calculated. After luring them in with the promise of a photo shoot, he would often take them to isolated locations where he had control. Once alone with his victims, Alcala's behavior would shift dramatically. He would sexually assault, torture, and ultimately murder his victims in ways that were particularly sadistic. Alcala's methods were highly violent. Some of his victims were strangled to death while others were bludgeoned or stabbed. In several cases, he engaged in what is known as overkill, a term used to describe excessive violence beyond what was necessary to cause death. This level of brutality indicated that Alcala derived a perverse pleasure not only from killing but also from causing prolonged suffering. In some instances, he would strangle his victims to the point of unconsciousness, then revive them, repeating the cycle multiple times before finally killing them. Despite the extreme violence of his crimes, Alcala was able to manipulate and evade authorities for years. He moved between different states, often committing crimes in one location before relocating to avoid detection. In addition to changing his physical appearance, Alcala was also highly skilled at manipulating those around him. He frequently charmed people into believing he was a harmless, charismatic figure, which helped him avoid suspicion. Alcala's intelligence and his ability to present himself as normal allowed him to slip through the cracks in the legal system, even when he was arrested for lesser crimes. In September 1978, Rodney Alcala made a now infamous appearance on the popular television show The Dating Game. At the time, Alcala was actively committing a series of brutal murders, yet he managed to slip under the radar and present himself as a charming, eligible bachelor. His appearance on the show has since become one of the most shocking and disturbing aspects of his criminal history. The Dating Game was a light-hearted show where a single woman known as the Bachelorette would ask a series of questions to 3 hidden contestants. Based on their answers, she would choose one to go on a date with. Alcala, using his real name, appeared as Bachelor Number 1. He was introduced to the audience as a successful photographer who enjoyed skydiving and motorcycling, a description that painted him as adventurous and exciting, qualities that helped him win over both the audience and the Bachelorette. During the episode, Alcala answered the Bachelorette's playful and flirtatious questions with suggestive and charming responses. His interaction with the Bachelorette, Cheryl Bradshaw, was lively, and he played into the light-hearted nature of the game. At one point, when asked what his ideal date would be, Alcala replied, "We're going to have a great time together, Cheryl," in a smooth and confident tone. Despite his unsettling double life, Alcala was able to maintain a calm and likable persona on screen. After the question and answer segment, Cheryl Bradshaw chose Alcala as the winner, based solely on his responses. He had successfully charmed her and the audience, and the show concluded with the pair scheduled to go on a chaperoned date. However, shortly after the taping, something about Alcala unsettled Bradshaw. She reportedly felt a strange vibe from him and ultimately refused to go on the date. Her intuition may very well have saved her life, as Alcala's dangerous tendencies were still unknown at the time. What makes this appearance on the dating game so disturbing is that Alcala was already in the midst of his killing spree. At the time of the episode's taping, he had already committed several murders, including the brutal assaults and killings of young women across California. His ability to maintain a friendly and charismatic facade while secretly living a life of violence shocked many when the truth about his crimes came to light. Years later, when Alcala was finally arrested and his crimes were revealed to the public, his appearance on the dating game became a focal point of media attention. People were horrified to learn that a man capable of such heinous acts had not only been walking free, but had also appeared on a national television show, charming millions of viewers. The fact that Alcala had won the game while actively murdering women only added to the public's shock. Rodney Alcala's series of brutal murders spanned several years and claimed the lives of numerous victims, many of whom were young women and girls. His ability to evade capture for so long can largely be attributed to his cunning nature and his ability to move between different states. However, several of his victims became key figures in the case that ultimately led to his arrest and conviction. One of the most significant victims was Robin Samsoe, a 12-year-old girl from Huntington Beach, California. On June 20th, 1979, Robin was riding her bike to a ballet class when she was approached by Alcala, who asked to take her picture. A friend of Robin's, who was with her at the time, later recounted that a man with a camera had spoken to them before Robin left on her own. When Robin failed to arrive at her class and didn't return home that evening, her family reported her missing. Tragically, her remains were discovered 12 days later in the foothills of the Sierra Madre Mountains. The discovery of Robin's body, along with the eyewitness testimony of her friend, ultimately led police to identify Alcala as a suspect. Robin Samsoe's murder marked a turning point in Alcala's criminal career. His connection to the case sparked an investigation that revealed his disturbing history and linked him to other unsolved murders. It was through Robin's case that authorities began to unravel the full extent of Alcala's crimes. In addition to Robin Samsoe, there were several other notable victims whose lives were tragically cut short by Alcala between 1977 and 1979. One of them was Jill Barkham, an 18-year-old girl from New York who had recently moved to Los Angeles. In November 1977, her body was found in the Hollywood Hills. She had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled. Barkham's case initially went unsolved, but DNA evidence later connected Alcala to her murder. Another victim was Georgia Wickstead, a 27-year-old nurse living in Malibu. On December 16, 1977, Wickstead was found in her apartment, having been bludgeoned with a hammer, sexually assaulted, and strangled. Like many of Alcala's victims, Wickstead had been overpowered and subjected to extreme violence before her death. Her case also went unsolved for years until Alcala was linked to her through forensic evidence. In June 1978, Charlotte Lamb, a 32-year-old legal secretary, was found dead in the laundry room of an apartment complex in El Segundo, California. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled with a shoelace. Investigators later determined that Alcala had encountered Lamb in the Los Angeles area, where he lured her to the location of her death. Jill Parenteau, a 21-year-old student, was another of Alcala's victims. In June 1979, just days before Robin Samsoe's disappearance, Parenteau was found dead in her Burbank apartment. Like many of Alcala's victims, she had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Her murder occurred in the midst of Alcala's killing spree, and she became one of the key victims whose case contributed to his eventual conviction. Alcala's arrest came shortly after the murder of Robin Samsoe, thanks to the eyewitness account from Robin's friend and a sketch artist's drawing based on her description of the man with the camera. Police tracked down Alcala and arrested him in July 1979. In his possession, they found a rental locker in Seattle containing photos of young women and girls, as well as earrings believed to belong to Robin Samsoe. These items became critical pieces of evidence in the case against him. Alcala's legal battles stretched over decades and involved multiple trials, appeals, and convictions. His first trial took place in 1980, where he was convicted of Robin Samsoe's murder and sentenced to death. However, the conviction was overturned in 1984 by the California Supreme Court due to concerns about the admission of evidence related to his prior criminal history. Specifically, the court ruled that details about Alcala's past sexual assaults, which had been introduced during the trial, might have biased the jury. A second trial was held in 1986, and once again Alcala was convicted of Robin's murder and sentenced to death. However, this conviction was also overturned in 2001, this time due to a procedural error involving a witness who had been hypnotized by police to help recall details of the crime. In 2003, advances in DNA technology provided investigators with a breakthrough in the case. DNA evidence linked Alcala to the murders of Jill Barkham, Georgia Wickstead, Charlotte Lamb, and Jill Parenteau, along with Robin Samsoe. Armed with this new forensic evidence, prosecutors sought to retry Alcala not only for Robin's murder, but also for the 4 additional murders. In 2010, Alcala was tried for the 3rd time. During this trial, the prosecution presented evidence from his previous crimes, including the photographs of unknown women found in his storage locker and the DNA links to his other victims. Alcala, representing himself, even played a portion of his The Dating Game appearance during the trial in an attempt to present himself as charming and innocent. Despite his efforts, he was found guilty of all 5 murders and sentenced to death once again. Alcala's case was not without complications. Over the years, the overturning of convictions and delays in the legal process frustrated the families of his victims. Despite being sentenced to death, Alcala remained on death row for years, appealing his convictions and exploiting legal loopholes. Even after his 2010 conviction, investigators continued to look into Alcala's possible connection to other unsolved cases, suspecting that the true number of his victims could be much higher. In 1979, after Rodney Alcala was arrested for the murder of 12-year-old Robin Samsoe, investigators uncovered a chilling trove of evidence that would suggest his crimes extended far beyond the known victims. Among Alcala's possessions was a storage locker in Seattle, Washington, which contained hundreds of photographs. These images, taken by Alcala under the guise of being a professional photographer, depicted young women, teenage girls, and even children, many of whom were in compromising, suggestive poses. The sheer volume of photographs, combined with Alcala's known methods of luring his victims through promises of photo shoots, led law enforcement to suspect that these women could represent additional undiscovered victims. When the photographs were first discovered, law enforcement had little means of identifying the individuals in the images. Many of the photos appeared to be candid shots, while others were clearly staged as part of Alcala's supposed artistic work. The backgrounds of the photos varied, with some taken in public places such as beaches or parks, and others appearing to have been taken in more private, isolated locations. This raised the terrifying possibility that some of these women and girls had met a similar fate to Alcala's known victims. Law enforcement released many of these photographs to the public in an effort to identify the individuals and determine if any of them were missing or deceased. The response to the release of the photographs was overwhelming. Many people came forward either identifying themselves or recognizing someone they knew. In some cases, the individuals in the photos were able to confirm that they had encountered Alcala but had managed to escape unharmed. However, a significant number of the women in the photos remained unidentified. This lack of identification suggested that some of these individuals might have fallen victim to Alcala's violent tendencies. As of today, many of these photographs remain a mystery, leaving the true extent of Alcala's crimes uncertain. The discovery of the photographs reignited interest in Alcala's possible connection to unsolved cold cases across the United States. In particular, investigators began reviewing cases of missing persons and unsolved homicides to determine if any could be linked to Alcala. Advances in DNA technology, which had proven instrumental in his 2010 trial, played a key role in these investigations. DNA samples collected from crime scenes, including evidence from victims who had been sexually assaulted or murdered, were re-examined to search for any connection to Alcala. In 2003, DNA evidence conclusively linked Alcala to the murders of 4 additional women: Jill Barkham, Georgia Wickstead, Charlotte Lamb, and Jill Parento. All 4 of these women had been brutally assaulted and murdered in California between 1977 and 1979. These murders had remained unsolved for years, but the DNA match to Alcala confirmed his responsibility. This development added to the growing body of evidence that Alcala had far more victims than initially believed. Further investigations also connected Alcala to crimes outside of California. In 2011, authorities in New York announced that DNA evidence had linked Alcala to 2 unsolved murders from the 1970s. The victims, Cornelia Crilly, a 23-year-old flight attendant, and Ellen Jane Hover, a 23-year-old aspiring entertainer, had both been murdered in New York City. Crilly was found strangled in her apartment in 1971, while Hover's remains were discovered in Westchester County, New York in 1977 after she had been missing for several months. Both cases had remained cold for decades, but with the help of DNA technology, Alcala was formally charged with their murders. These links to cold cases, combined with the unidentified women in Alcala's photographs, suggest that the true number of his victims could be far higher than the confirmed cases. Investigators have speculated that Alcala may have committed murders in other states as well, including Washington and possibly New Hampshire, where he briefly worked as a camp counselor under an alias in the early 1970s. Despite the evidence pointing to additional victims, many of these cases remain unsolved, and the identities of several women in the photographs are still unknown. Rodney Alcala, one of the most notorious serial killers of the 20th century, died on July 24, 2021, at the age of 77. His death occurred at Corcoran State Prison in California, where he had been on death row for over a decade. Alcala passed away from natural causes, reportedly related to long-standing health issues. Over the years, he had suffered from multiple medical conditions, including cancer, which contributed to his deteriorating state. Despite being sentenced to death for the brutal murders of at least 5 women and a young girl, he never faced execution and remained on death row until his final days. Alcala's death brought an end to one of the most prolonged and complex legal sagas in California's history. His case had spanned decades, with repeated trials, convictions, and appeals that highlighted significant flaws in the legal system. His ability to evade justice for so long and his numerous legal battles kept his name in the public eye long after his initial arrest. His death on death row without facing the death penalty added another layer to the public's complex response to his life and crimes. Although Alcala had been convicted of 5 murders, authorities believed the true number of his victims could be far higher. His death left many questions unanswered, especially in regard to the unidentified women and children in the photographs found in his possession. Despite extensive efforts to identify all of his victims, many of these cases remain unsolved, and some families may never know the fate of their loved ones. In this sense, Alcala's death represented a lost opportunity for further revelations about the full extent of his crimes. Alcala's legacy is one of horror and tragedy, as his ability to deceive both his victims and the public for so long has left a lasting impact on the families of those he killed and on society as a whole. His case is often cited in discussions about how serial killers can blend into society using charm and manipulation to cover up their true nature. Alcala's infamous appearance on The Dating Game, his photographic collection of unidentified women, and his years spent evading capture serve as stark reminders of how difficult it can be to detect such individuals before they strike again. Thanks for watching. If you found this video informative, make sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button for more true crime content. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. We've got plenty of stories coming your way, and we'd love to have you join the conversation. Stay tuned.